we allowed 1991 Iraq to happen. The beginnings of a license for immorality lie in that period.
Don't you also see a legitimacy problem with China and Russia taking the lead in something like this?
Does international law matter? Or can we actually put it all aside? I hope I don't get back to South Africa and get arrested.
When you go back to you standing on those steps, did you think that the next 9 months would unfold in the way it has?
Our neighborhood had our back. And this is not the case with the people of Palestine.
Former Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor. Well, good. Hi, good day and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. Today I'm very honored to be speaking to the former minister, the foreign minister of South Africa, Dr. Naledi Pandor. Dr. Pandor, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for the opportunity. I know you're extremely busy and you've given us the hour, so we'll try to make the most use of it. Obviously, we're going to speak about Israel's actions in Gaza. We're going to speak about the case that South Africa brought to the ICJ. But I also want to speak about being a South African and how you can relate that to what you're seeing unfolding in Palestine, in Gaza, and what you've seen unfolding there, I guess, from the first time you knew about the conflict. Can you tell me about the mechanics, about what decisions were taken in the corridors of South African power to sort of say, let's take this course, let's take this case to the ICJ? I mean, was it you who led the charge? Was it the president? Was it one of your interns who maybe suggested it? Like, just how did that sort of come about, and what made you take the case forward? Because you started the work to get it done quite soon after Israel started retaliating to what happened on October 7th.
Well, you know, I've just left government and there are all sorts of rules about secrets and all of that. So I hope I don't get back to South Africa and get arrested. But in the period November to early December, several activists and academics were writing to South Africa. I don't know why they chose us. And they were saying, what's happening is unconscionable. We need to invoke one of the treaties or conventions and act on this and put Israel before the court of public opinion by taking up the case in terms of international law, because clearly international law is being breached. One of the persons that was raising this consistently was Professor Dugard, who is a renowned South African human rights lawyer. He and many others were writing, and actually, you know, I hadn't read the convention on genocide, but I was forced to begin to take an interest in it because of these letters. And then in one meeting in cabinet, our young Minister of Justice, who probably had been getting similar emails, sent me a note to say, can't we look at the matter of the convention on genocide and take up a case against Israel? What do you think? Let me know what you think. So I went back, looked at it, spoke to our lawyers, and said to him, well, I think, you know, there is plausible reason to do so. So let's approach the president and see whether we can bring this to cabinet. We then carried out this approaches to everybody, also to academic lawyers, and, you know, talked to a number of people. And I had, you know, thought that justice would take it up, but the Justice Department couldn't, because we are signatories as Foreign Affairs. So it's the foreign minister who has to raise the matter. So we prepared our memorandum, and we had to make sure we do so very quietly. So no one really knew. It was just President, myself, Minister of Justice, my Director General. And we then went to cabinet, and I knew that there would be massive opposition in our country because we have a strong Zionist lobby. So once cabinet had considered the matter, and the discussion in cabinet was, why has this taken so long? You know, please proceed. Because everybody was concerned at what was happening. So we got ready. And the only thing I asked was that please don't say anything publicly, because we don't want to be stopped before we get to the court. So we prepared. We spent all of that December preparing. And by end of December, we were ready to make the submission. So, we did it very quietly. The day we submitted, we made the announcement. So by the time, the opposition knew, we'd already, moved. And it was the decision of government that we do so.
When you first took it to the president, you and the justice minister, how did he receive it? Because there's a lot of political risk in terms of, retribution from the United States, from other actors in the north. How did he receive it?
We're experiencing it now. He said, proceed,
Fully, like no doubts, no hey.
Fully supported us.
And cabinet was exactly the same.
Yes, absolutely.
Was there ever concern that, for example, economic treaties that you have, like AGOA, for instance, which allows
Minister of Finance was fully behind it, trade and industry. I recall what everybody said, I recorded it because I knew it's not going to be easy.
Yes.
But I had full support.
Were you surprised by the fact that there was so little resistance?
It's always been a very strong feeling about Palestine.
And linked to South Africa.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to come back a bit to how. In fact, let's talk about it right now. So the case goes ahead, and there's this video of you that's gone all over the world of you standing on the steps outside the court, speaking about what was seen. It's been disputed now by media pundits, but which was obviously, I think, a victory for the submitters of the case, for the applicants, for yourself. Basically, the court agreed to all of your requests except for the ceasefire.
Measures, yeah.
Right, and I recall you saying on the steps that effectively, in order for Israel to actually comply with the humanitarian protections that the court had put in place, a ceasefire has to follow. Yeah. Right, it obviously didn't follow. It was the 26th of January that you actually made those statements. At that point, the devastation in Gaza, 26,000 people already been killed, but was substantially less, even though it was very extreme, than what's the case now. When you go back to you standing on those steps, did you think that the next 9 months would unfold in the way it has?
I didn't think 9 months. I really thought the world would intervene. Because, the world has been, and by this I mean, countries in the West are always so vocal, that you should respect the ICC. You must respect international law. We've been lectured, about Africans don't respect human rights and all of this. And here it was an African country that was upholding international law. So I didn't think that they would allow it to last as long as it has, this onslaught. I was aware and did suspect Israel would not respect the decisions of the court because they've got this attitude that they're a country that can do as they like with any Palestinian person. So I was not surprised that Israel did not respond. But what I was happy about was we brought them into a significant international institution, and they had to attempt, and I use attempt advisedly, to defend what they have done. And I believe they failed to do so. So while I was very careful during the interview not to signal a victory, I didn't, by any means have a triumphalist notion. But I believe the step that was taken was important, was necessary, and was a vital affirmation of the significance of international law. And what it has illustrated is that Israel believes it can act as it wishes, and the world must now make a decision. Does international law matter, or can we actually put it all aside? And I think there's a real danger in not having international protections.
Right now, Israel consistently says that the UN and most of its institutions, the General Assembly, the Secretary General is anti-Semitic. The repertoire to Palestine and Gaza is anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
You are anti-Semitic. It's banned UNRWA now through the Knesset. It's UNRWA, which is a vital agency which provides education, food, aid to a refugee population in Palestine and outside of Palestine. Donald Trump is now going to be the president of the USA. In his first term, he was very anti-international institutions. Even while Biden was the president, there was pressure most likely put on the ICC, prosecuted, and that's why we don't yet have a warrant out on Netanyahu and Gallant. I mean, obviously, Sinwar and Hania have been killed, right? So there can't be a warrant on them. But are we in danger, like especially with the Trump presidency, of really seeing the UN being defunded quite substantially and international law breaking down?
Well, I think that we're now in a position where there are countries through BRICS that could become a force of a different set of perspectives. But I don't know whether they have the courage to be that alternative. The reason we've had the problems that we have is there isn't a counterweight to the received wisdom of the North at the moment, politically. And we need that force, and it is really countries of the South aligning with China, with Russia, that might be that vehicle of an alternative way of thinking of the world. And I think that has to be brought into play if the challenges you refer to come into realization. Because we are fully supportive of multilateralism. We reject any notion of getting rid of the United Nations or continuing to diminish its stature and role, because we believe it is and should be the premier global body. We would like to see it being reformed, but we believe it should be strengthened in order to have the capacity to protect the innocent. I think the absence of an enforcement capacity is really what led to the devastation we're seeing today in Palestine. So urgent reform, significant progressive changes are necessary, but allowing the demise of the United Nations, I think, would be a huge mistake for the world. But it's up to African countries, countries of the South, Brazil, India, and the force that they bring to really articulating an alternative. And whether they're ready, to confront the West is something I'm unsure of.
I can see how, in terms of both, even economically now, because China is extremely strong. India, now China is the second biggest economy in the world. India will soon be the third biggest economy in the world. I can see how economically and politically BRICS and the South could be a counterweight. And I'm not trying to say that the North has a lot of legitimacy in terms of its behavior with regards to human rights, but don't you also see a legitimacy problem with China and Russia taking the lead in something like this?
It exists with everybody, doesn't it?
Yes.
A question of legitimacy, because we haven't really upheld positive values. But my preference would be for a BRICS rather than what we have today.
Because it's a counterweight, or because, mainly because of
it has the potential to be, should it grow significantly and assert progressive ideas. That is going to be the big test. Otherwise, it becomes a mere mirror of what exists already, and I don't know whether countries that are part of BRICS wish to be that. I know Brazil would like to see something different. I know South Africa would like to see something different, and several other countries within the BRICS family. But there are political differences, there are disappointments, and we need to acknowledge that as well, and I'm honest about it.
I know you're not the foreign minister anymore, but how is the discussions going, if you're privy to them, with regards to the other members who are potentially going to join BRICS soon after the BRICS conference in South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt? Do you see that now expanding, or do you think what's occurred in Gaza is going to accelerate that, or is actually de-accelerated that, or it's going to reframe those discussions?
From my understanding, I'm not part of government any longer, but the list of interested countries has grown. Egypt is a member already. UAE, several other countries have joined. Iran is a member, very active. Saudi Arabia had indicated an intention to join, but has paused the process. I don't know why, but many countries wish to be part of BRICS.
Okay, just moving a bit now to your own story and your own life. Not too much, because I'm sure you don't want to speak too much about yourself. But just how did you get involved in the struggle for freedom and in South African politics? What sort of made you think that you should get involved? What did you witness? What did you see? How did you feel? What motivated you to get involved?
Well, I was telling some of the colleagues last night that I actually hated politics, and I was determined I would not be a politician. I come from a political family. My father and grandfather were in the struggle against apartheid. They were leaders in the African National Congress. And we had to leave our home in South Africa when I was a little girl.
This home was where in South Africa?
I was born in Durban.
Okay.
And, one night, our mother was bundling us into this car and off we went. Next morning, we found ourselves in a country called Lesotho. We didn't know the language and so on. A few years later, off we were to another country, and that's how I grew up. So to me, politics was associated with that kind of disruption. And I had promised myself I would not do what my dad is doing. And then I suppose when you're in a political family, you live politics. They talk about it every day. Our parents were very worried because of exile that we'll forget that we are African and that there's a struggle back home. So they constantly said, remember, there's a struggle. There's apartheid, but we're going to defeat it, and one day we'll be free and we're going to go back. So this was in one's head. The other thing was that for many of us, our parents in exile insisted that we take education seriously. And I became an education activist. That's how I got involved. I believed education was the vehicle for Black people for freedom. And a freedom where our intellectual resources would be brought to bear in creating a different South Africa. So I worked with education organizations in Southern Africa, worked in Botswana, eventually got my way into my country, did a lot of organizing with young people, with worker organizations, women's groupings. So that's how I got involved, really. It's through a political family. But it was never my intention. When the ANC asked me in '93 to become a member of Parliament, to be on the list for candidates, I refused initially. I said, no, I'm an academic. I was lecturing at university. I want to be a professor. And they said, no, we really need some of our academics to become, members of Parliament to support the process of crafting, a new constitution, new laws, and so on. So eventually, my family persuaded me to join, and here I'm there. 30 years there.
You've mentioned the strong solidarity that many South Africans and the ruling party in particular has with Palestinians. When was your own conscientization of what was happening in Palestine? When were you first made aware, and when did you first feel a sense of affinity with the Palestinian struggle?
Very early on, because part of the family education was about struggles. And so I knew that there was someone called Yasser Arafat who was leading Fatah, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and that these were our comrades. They were supporting us in training our cadres. So, knew about China, Mao Zedong, Russia, Soviet Union. So, we had that background taught to us. There's a lot of political education in these families. And that's really, causes...
What is that? Was that dinner conversation? Was that your father having a book club? Like, what was it?
Dinner, conversations, horrible movies, those real films. So we used to watch those, and others used to come to the house and,
and this is all
watching, the Big March and all those films. Lesotho, Zambia, London.
Yeah.
So, we were aware. We're a reading family. We were taught to read, to be aware of the world. The first march I was part of was at university in support of the struggle in China. So, it's really being aware.
And when was the first time you actually visited the occupied territories?
I was on my way there on the 7th of October, 2022.
So you hadn't been until you were supposed to go there. So you
on
still
my
haven't
way
been.
there, and I was in Dubai about to go and board the plane to Jordan.
Okay.
And they phoned to say, go back, So I still have to get there.
We've seen the devastation. Just how can you quantify how Palestinians and Palestinians in Gaza will eventually be able to overcome the destruction that's been brought upon them and is still being brought upon them?
Well, I think it's very difficult to quantify, and what one feels is a sense of as a human being, deep shame that such a catastrophe could occur in the 21st century. And we, as part of humanity, are actually quite useless in terms of being able to save innocent lives. So I think one feels a real sense of, awful pain for the people of Palestine. And their oppression has lasted a very, very long time, much longer than the apartheid that we had to endure as Black South Africans in South Africa. But we recognize oppression because we've experienced it. And there are startling similarities between apartheid Israel and apartheid South Africa in terms of statutory practices, the absence of human rights, a legal framework that doesn't recognize the rights of others or offer protection to citizens, the breach of international law, and of course the occupation that is a direct breach of the Charter of the United Nations. And in that context, we also recognize the failure of the United Nations, and particularly the Security Council, to address the concerns of the Palestinian people and their just cause for freedom. So just, it's a range of failures that have not served to bring freedom and basic rights to the people of Palestine.
I just want to speak a bit about how a nation sort of heals itself. Right now in South Africa, for example, we had the Bantu Education Act, which denied 2 generations of proper education. At the moment, in Palestine, in Gaza, all the universities have been destroyed. Most of the schools have been destroyed. The schools are being used as makeshift shelters and are being bombed, and people are moving from one shelter to the other. At least 43,000 people have been killed. Lancet 3 months ago said the number is probably close to 186,000. So maybe now the number by indirect conflict maybe up to 250,000. Given from your experience and how you've seen South Africa develop and fail to develop in the last 30 years because of the legacy of apartheid, just try to give us a sense of just how difficult that journey may be. Obviously you don't know, but just what do you think it's going to be like?
I'm convinced from our own experience that the Palestinian question will only be resolved through negotiation. I don't think you can destroy people's desire for freedom and continue to deny them freedom. I think it's unconscionable, and the world won't be able to defend it for longer. Now, the issue is what form, of institution or country will emerge from the current conflict. And that's something I think all of us should attempt to play a role in imagining, working closely with the Palestinian leadership and the broader mass organizations in Palestine. One of the features of our own struggle for freedom was that in the course of waging this battle against apartheid, the leadership of the liberation movements and the membership always tried to define a vision of a future South Africa. And the notion of a single state was a very important one, and one in which diversity would be embraced and recognized in law, and then also the basis of human rights. So documents such as the African Claims Document, the Freedom Charter eventually, the Harare Declaration. So there was always the sense that we are waging a struggle for something and we have a vision. We need to see that articulated much more clearly by the political organizations of Palestine. I think there isn't sufficient attention to defining what that vision might look like. The reason may lie in the nature of offense that is committed by the oppressive regime. Of course, apartheid was terrible, and it's difficult to compare, one evil to another. But I think what the Palestinian people have experienced is unprecedented violence against innocent people. In South Africa, we were able to organize, but also the manner of organization was very different from what exists in Palestine today. We had essentially liberation movements which, although they may have had ideological differences, had the same objective of winning freedom for the majority population, but also for everyone who resides in South Africa. So there are parallels, there are comparisons, but there are also vast differences. We were able to persuade the world to support us in our struggle, and I think we essentially coined the active notion of international solidarity and brought it to bear in the struggle against apartheid. And it was a very important instrument because we united civil society across the globe to become active participants in our struggle against apartheid. We need to secure similar solidarity in support of the people of Palestine. We need to make it a reality that Israel is a pariah for its actions against an innocent people. Linked to that, Israel, of course, has been supported by very powerful countries in the north. And I think they have an important duty to ensure that this awful terror that is being waged against the people of Palestine leads to them assuming responsibility for the reconstruction of Palestine. This is something that I hope all those who currently are actively in support of the just cause of the people of Palestine, that they do not forget the need to follow through. Once freedom is won with us, people thought, South Africa is a wealthy country. You now have, the black majorities governing, so we're just going to leave them alone. And they forgot that they were supporting apartheid for centuries, that supported racism, that they owned the high ranks of the economy in our country, controlled mining resources and so on. They just said, you're now in control, it's a wealthy country, go ahead and govern. Very little grant support, no reconstruction, even the improvement of education, you do it on your own. When we came into power, we suddenly had to deal with a majority and with very inadequate resources. I hope that Palestine is not left to face that kind of very difficult situation where the international community believes once you've secured political power, they then can exit and leave you alone to deal with the rest of a very complex socioeconomic problem.
You've unpacked a lot in that answer. I want to hone in specifically, you were part of the freedom struggle, so you know exactly how difficult it is and sort of the security police and the detentions, but just how formidable, from the outside looking in, when you look at Israel and Palestine, how formidable an enemy are the Palestinians up against?
A very formidable enemy.
Why?
I think largely because Israel has the support of the West in terms of military power. They also have the sanction, which is a terrible sanction, of impunity. The West allows them to do as they will because of a guilt that exists with respect to the history of the Holocaust. But the Holocaust was not waged by Palestinian people. So why must they bear the consequence of that terrible act? So I think the West needs to free itself of this notion that you can actually act in an inhumane way toward another people because we acted inhumanely toward you. The Palestinians have become the victim of the history of the Holocaust and of this fear that the West has of acknowledging the terrible deeds that were committed against Jewish people in Europe. So I believe that the West needs to embrace the notion that all persons are deserving of freedom and human rights, no matter who they are. And at the moment, it has been that Israeli people or people of Jewish extraction are deserving, but Palestinians are not. And I think it's linked to a great degree both to this impunity I've referred to, but also to a very, I think, evil manifestation of Islamophobia that exists in the North. And so if you have a character that is of a Muslim faith, in some way you're less than human and less worthy of consideration in terms of protection. And I think all these aspects, these elements are mixed together in a really terrible mix that brings this catastrophic situation to the Palestinian people.
And you mentioned Islamophobia, and you mentioned sort of the white gaze and how it sees Muslims and Arabs. One of the turning points in apartheid, and it actually took a while for it to turn, but when we like to think about apartheid, one of the turning points was 1976 and the Soweto riots. And obviously it was a devastation crime of the white police on black students. And it did start turning the corner just a little bit in terms of national sort of support and solidarity. How is it that something, a very grave crime by the white police that killed lots of black students was able to turn the opinion a little bit, and yet we have now an entire enclave that's been besieged for 16, 17 years. Right now, for the last year, it's under massive siege, massive bombardment. There's been more explosives, more bombs dropped on it than any other place, including in World War II. How is it that this has just been allowed to go on? You and your country have led a case of genocide against Israel. The court has asked for Israel to act responsibly, not to stop short of a ceasefire. And that was 9 months ago. I mean, is the Holocaust and Islamophobia enough to explain this? Or like what's going on?
Well, I think people are not regarded as equal. I think there's a lot of racism attached to it, a lot of double standard in the practice of international relations. And I think that the world has developed an attitude that some people matter and others don't. And this is a large part of the problematic that we face in the world today. But I think it's important to point out, as I said earlier, while there are parallels, there are distinctions. We had a very weighty, organized form, the African National Congress, a liberation movement, and others, AZAPO, PAC, but ANC was the leader, essentially. Now, what the ANC did was refine the political strategy quite significantly. So you had different aspects to it. There was the international dimension, which helped to support boycott and sanctions and isolation. Then you had the mass mobilization, which was internal, and the people, the majority, would act on the basis of campaigns that came out of the international domain of the struggle. So mass mobilization was very significant. I don't know to what degree there's a leadership in Palestine that can mobilize the masses in a similar fashion. You also had then the underground, which was very, very important, where resources could be brought in to ensure that the mass mobilization actually gets off the ground, that you get the pamphlets out, that people are protesting, they're aware that there will be a stay away for a particular week. So that underground was very, very important. And I think we often neglect to associate that underground movement with what occurred in 1976. So while 1976 and the student uprising was organic, you had cells throughout South Africa, and there's much archival material that indicates there was communication, exchange of ideas, there were instructions coming through. So the underground network was extremely important, and it linked in with the international solidarity movement. Then the fourth element is, of course, armed struggle. So With our struggle, there was quite an organized aspect to it. You know, there was structure, there was form, there was ideology, there was strategy and tactics. And I think we need to see similar levels of organization and thought about this is a struggle, it's very complex, very difficult, there's an enemy, very sophisticated, supported by powerful forces. How do you secure similar levels of support?
Don't you think, though, that I mean, obviously, I have the greatest respect for the freedom struggle. It gave me my freedom, and yes, when I look at how the ANC organize themselves, I'm often blown away by the tact, the sophistication, the sense of solidarity, the ability to act strategically. But fundamentally, the Palestinians are just up against something completely different. You mentioned international aid and help to the organization. Most organizations now that try to help Palestinians, especially an organization that could be as lethal to the objectives of Israel as the ANC was to the objectives of apartheid, would probably be deemed illegal or terrorist or something of that sort. Obviously people in South Africa were detained, they were killed, they were assassinated. The level of assassination of leadership, the assassination of young students, people who could potentially grow up. Just how do you think that plays into what is perceived as the inability of the Palestinians to organize themselves strategically?
Well, I think it plays in. I don't have sufficient knowledge to really, fully analyze it, but drawing on our own experience and observing and working closely with comrades in Palestine, I do think there is inadequate organizational thought. There are too many factions, civil society is not working in a coherent manner, and I think sometimes international aid is actually a source of division. So I do think there needs to be thought about how all the forces could be marshaled together. And I believe this is a moment where that might happen. But what are the reasons for the level of harm that we're seeing? I think they derive largely from the fact that we allowed 1991 Iraq to happen. The beginnings of a license for immorality lie in that period. And over several decades, there's developed a notion that might is right and that you can do what you want against a group, a people, a country. Terror, you can label terrorist, particularly if it's in the Middle East region. Also linked is the fact that with our struggle, our neighborhood was with us. With the Palestinian people, there's no Botswana, there isn't a Lesotho, there isn't a Namibia, there isn't a Zimbabwe. We had all of them, and they protected us. They gave us exile, they gave us opportunity to organize, and they were very ready to have the parcel bombs of the apartheid state. They didn't throw us out when that happened. So I think the notion of the neighborhood and its support and the regional organizations, the Organization of African Unity made very clear decisions about isolating the apartheid state. And so countries in Africa would not allow, most of them, there were one or two who breached, but in the main, our neighborhood had our back. And this is not the case with the people of Palestine. And yet, they live in a very powerful neighborhood that could have a massive impact on their search for freedom.
When you see the war, we're going to come back to the horrible war that's going on right now. You mentioned earlier that you can only see liberation manifesting itself after negotiations, right? Do you think we're closer to that negotiation given the events of the war? To a large extent, Palestinian society, even in the West Bank, is now being crushed. How will there be an end to this?
Only Allah knows. I don't know. But eventually they will have to sit around the table. I don't think the world will be able to tolerate or accept a total genocide. So this has to stop, and the world has to stop it at some point. And I hope that the end will be soon, because it's really terrible. The destruction, of a whole group with the world watching is actually, as I said earlier, a shame on all of us. But at the moment, I cannot see active steps being taken toward bringing an end. I think Qatar has made an attempt, but we keep faltering. So we've got to continue, to protest, to act, to agitate. And part of what I believe needs to happen is there must be greater activism by civil society organizations. I really think we need to reconstitute an anti-apartheid solidarity in support of the people of Palestine. And we need to have common action as this global solidarity movement and ensure that we devise campaigns that would isolate Israel and make it stand out as a pariah, as we did with apartheid South Africa. So I'm a little concerned that there are too many disparate activities and we're not building a sufficient, coherent, united force. So I am sort of agitating for re-establishing an international anti-apartheid campaign globally. There are enough, I think, activists who've been awoken. We constituted a meeting in South Africa last year of the former global anti-apartheid activists. We had 35 countries present. We are using that to establish chapters, which we hope eventually we can draw together as a global movement. So South Africa, as part of its expression of thanks to those who helped liberate us, is attempting to play a role, and I'm talking about civil society, not government, to play a role in re-energizing global activism on this matter.
I hear all of that, and I hear about all the activism. But at the same time, I sometimes think, and this is not a criticism of anything you've said at all, but I sometimes think that hope is almost, while it's a very essential human ingredient, it's almost our worst enemy, because we kind of hope it will end. Yeah, we kind of can't believe that this genocide is still continuing. And it just is.
Well, it must be brought to an end, and I'm saying the only way you can do so is to have clear campaigns. We should have been better organized before the Olympics to ensure Israel wasn't there. We need to do so with other international activities. But if you don't have a vehicle that is focused on that, you're not going to achieve the results. We did so with South Africa. So I think similar campaigns and structures are necessary. So I'm not saying you rely on hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've got to rely on action. And what you need is to consolidate the current activism that has arisen in response to the terrible plight of the Palestinian people. Because we cannot rely on woe is me. We cannot rely on protest. We have to ensure that a pinch is felt. And I think it's through uniting action and cooperating globally that you could achieve that.
Thank you so much, former Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor.
Thank you.